The rain struck my windshield like thrown coins, each a sharp accusation, and I could taste salt on my tongue, the way you taste the last word of someone you've loved, metallic and impossible to swallow. Tomas Rivas pounded on my passenger door with hands that smelled of diesel and fish, eyes bright and too wide in a face the ocean had carved into grief. Behind him, the sea frothed like a throat about to speak, and I thought, inexplicably, of the little red shoes my sister left on the porch when she ran away at 17. He leaned against the glass and said, as if telling me to remember something essential, "They're taking them, Doc. They come from under. Aliens underwater are attacking the population." Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. I nearly locked the doors. My thumb hovered over the keyless button like a judge, deciding whether this interrupted life counted as evidence or delusion. Grant deadlines had curdled into a constant hum in my skull. Emails unread, budgets denied, a university committee that liked the idea of research more than the messy, wet reality of it. I told myself habitually that I had no time for drama. Yet the sound of his breath, ragged and salt-soured, punctured the armor of my daily refusals. The rain made his beard into a map of grief, and in that map I read a boy's name, Diego, and a date worn into the skin around his mouth. The moment felt less like chance and more like a summons. I opened the door. Tomas slid in like a confession. He smelled of seaweed and the blue of long afternoons, and his jacket clung to him with the memory of storms. He didn't apologize, which was the first honest thing he did. He sat with his hands on his knees, jaw working. "Thank you," he said, voice small in the car's chromed light. "My truck's gone, out of juice, dead as a cod. Phone's drowned. Saw your headlights, thought." He stopped. The rain talked loud in the seams of the world. "You're soaked," I said, because people who study oceans talk about things like temperature gradients when they mean whether someone will get pneumonia. I fished the emergency blanket from my trunk, the one with the university logo, awkward and bright, and wrapped it around him. It made him look like an ironic saint, a fisherman worthy of a bad painting. He laughed once, a short, incredulous sound. "Saints don't get shipwrecked," he said. "Tell me what happened, Tomas," I said. I used his name like a hook. It was an old habit. Names first, data later. He blinked and began, slow as tide.
He told a story stitched with ache. Nights of lights under the water that moved too perfectly to be fish. Sonar pings from his little boat that returned with handwriting not his own. Radio static that spelled his son's voice in a language he didn't know how to translate. Diego went out 2 months ago, he said, for a routine check on the traps. Came back 3 hours late. Sittin' in the bow, looking like he'd seen the bottom of the world. Said he saw lights, Lena. Said they wasn't fish. I told myself he was spooked. I told myself the Gulf plays tricks. He swallowed, and the wet light in his eyes turned to a single hard coin. Then his face changed. He stopped calling me Pa. He looked like somebody else's son by the time he climbed back on board. I watched him, cataloging. Voice tremor, tremble in his fingers, the way his shoulders carried a load no one should ask any one person to bear. He spoke of fishermen missing nights, boats found with empty coffee cups, lines cut clean as new skin, and the radio programs that had advised calm, that had broadcast official platitudes about currents and maritime migration. But then there's the sonar, he insisted. Strange signatures, things that move at speeds no known creature should. And it's not just here. Folks on the West Pier say the same, folks I used to drink with. It's like something's mapping us. I should have rolled my eyes and handed him a business card. I am, after all, Lena Serrano, marine ecologist, precise professional, the kind of scientist who framed questions more than answers them. I keep logs like hymns, temperature profiles, salinity gradients, acoustic spectrums. For months, I'd been compiling anomalous acoustic blips from the coastal arrays, odd harmonics at depths that made no sense, data that the grants office called intriguing but inconclusive. My inbox contained phrases like insufficient evidence and possible instrument error. But Tomas's hands, salted by toil, felt like a ledger of a different sort. He wasn't asking for a lecture. He wanted someone to believe him. "Aliens underwater are attacking the population," he said again, softer. The storm pressed its face to the car as the world reduced to 4 seats and 2 wet souls. There, he stopped, searching for language that wasn't his. They can make people forget, or they make them not want to remember. Diego said they sang like a choir and showed him stars that weren't in our sky. He came home saying he's been to a ship like the belly of a whale and saw lights moving like constellations underwater. He kept looking at me like he didn't know who I was. He kept saying he had to go back. 3 days later, he vanished. When he said vanished, a sound split me open, less like grief than like an alarm in my ribs. Vanish. The word landed and rewrote context. I had seen disappearance papers in my work, tags on carcasses, labels on seaweeds, but never the word applied to a boy who could skip stones and swore he saw comet tails in the Gulf.
The thought of Diego slipping under a surface that had always been safe felt like treason. "Do you have recordings?" I asked, before I knew I would. If there was data to collect, then there was reason, some small anchor in method that kept me from melting into mere sympathy. Tomas reached into his jacket with fingers like rope. His hands shook when he produced a cheap digital recorder, taped to the underside as if it were contraband. He pressed play. The sound that came out was small and sibilant, a siren of clicks layered over a low whale-like moan, the sort of thing we archive with neutral tags. I lifted the volume. Underneath it, something else threaded. The tremulous whisper of a voice, saying a word in a rhythm that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The recorder's battery was meek. The signal fluttered like a dying moth. "You can hear it?" Tomas asked. "I hear anomalies," I said, the scientist returning like reflex. Every hair in me wanted to tug this into a lab, filter noise, run FFTs, map frequency bands. But another part, probably the part that got me out of the lab on stormy nights, felt the syllables as if they were a touch. The voice on the recording wasn't Morse or language as I'd cataloged it. It pressed images into my mind like a thumbprint, light as teeth, a swimming cathedral, a memory of being watched by someone impossibly old and very young at the same time. Air brakes moaned in the dark beyond the windshield. Headlights smeared across rain. For the first time since I had offered him shelter, Tomas's face found its way to the present. "They've been here a lot more since the Navy started showing up," he said. "Ships with black hulls and men in uniforms who don't smile. They ask questions, but never the right ones. They take people's tapes, Lena. They say it's for the safety of the public. But safe from what? From truth? From panic? From us knowing we're not alone?" I felt the old bureaucratic reflex. Report anomalies, file for oversight, let the official channels hose down the fire until it became a cautionary tale for undergrads. But that same reflex had failed Diego, a boy whose name had become a knot in a man's throat. My research hadn't been able to compel attention. Grants were people saying, maybe later. And here was a man, offered no audience but my car seat and the dim dashboard light, speaking a truth that had no form in the grant proposals. "They said they'll make you forget you ever had someone," Tomas whispered, the words fraying. "They did it to my neighbor's girl. She woke up with her hair braided and a sweater she'd never owned, couldn't remember her 21st birthday. Doctors wrote it off as psychogenic, as if grief can be parceled and labeled by a white coat. But if it's them, if they're out there and they can touch memories, what do we become?" The question hung between us, heavy as gulls on a wire. I felt suddenly like a fulcrum, small and sharp and necessary.
The scientist in me cataloged possibilities: acoustic-induced amnesia, neurochemical pathways manipulated via bioacoustics, misattributed dementia exacerbated by trauma. The woman, whose sister had left porcelain footprints into her life, thought of little things nations don't always count. Names lost, the smell of someone's jacket, the ritual of a shared coffee. I thought of Diego, and the way his son can be an entire map for a father's days. "Do you want me to look into it?" I asked, using language I could afford. Investigate, gather, analyze. He exhaled a sound that might have been gratitude or the beginning of surrender. "I don't want the Navy, Lena. I don't want the men in black to take my boat and take my tapes and put me in front of a camera and make it all about what we didn't see. I want my son back. I want—" He paused, and the rain made its own meaning against the glass.
I want not to be the only one who remembers there's more to fear than storms. We sat like that for a long time, the world reduced to the smell of wet wool and the steady hum of my heater. In the background, the sea kept talking, a sound you learn to ignore when you live by it, but tonight every splash was a footnote. A pair of headlights rounded the headland and came closer, too organized, too intent. The rain turned the lights into a smear of authority, and for a sliver of a second I saw how small we were. A woman in a scientist's jacket, a fisherman with a recorder, and 2 seats in a car that couldn't keep the ocean from reminding us of the scale of what we faced. "There's a man I used to fish with," Tomas said finally. "Pedro. He disappeared last week. Boat found with the motors still warm, nets undisturbed. No sign of struggle. You ever seen a hull with wounds like a bite?" His mouth made a shape like a map of absence. "No," I said, and the certainty of that small truth felt both absurd and dangerous. No is a fragile word when measured against the universe. "Our town's been quiet about it because quiet keeps things alive," Tomas said. "But now he swallowed. They're taking people in the night. Not all of them, not everyone, but enough that the pattern's there." The headlights slowed at the road end and then moved on. The world made noise as if to persuade us it was nothing. A police siren in the distance, gulls complaining. But the feeling that had lodged under my ribs didn't leave. My training offered me instruments. My heart offered me impatience. If the anomalies in my data matched Tomas's tapes, if the Navy that should be protecting us was instead sequestering evidence, if something from below could touch the most private tapestry of memory, then we were at the beginning of something that wasn't just scientific, it was moral. "Come to the lab tomorrow," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "I'll need files, dates, times, anything you got." He hesitated. The car smelled of wet wool and the suggestion of hope like an illicit thing. "The Navy," he began.
"I'll try to keep it quiet," I said, which was a lie and a promise. I had no clearance, no authority to protect him. I had only a battered laptop, a microscope that reflected my tired face, and a stubbornness that had seen me through failing budgets. It might be nothing. It might be everything. The choice to look, to check, to believe, no matter the outcome, felt in that thunder and rain like the only honest thing left to do. Tomas nodded, a small, wary thing. He tucked the recorder back into his jacket like a talisman. We stepped into the rain together to get his truck, 2 creatures adrift in a coast town that pretended to sleep while something under its skin hummed. As the storm swallowed our figures, I found myself thinking not of data charts, but of the sea's double face, nourishing and devouring, cradle and grave, and felt the peculiar, sharp pull of being called to witness. That night I would write notes that would smell faintly of fish and cigarette smoke. I would tell myself I was being careful. In the back of my mind, the image of Diego's face, unfinished, missing, would sit like a hole you can't stitch. When I drove home, rain beating on the windshield like a new set of punctuation marks, I knew a difficult decision waited, whether to share what I might find and risk the panic and government censure Tomas feared, or to bury it where it would fester, safe and secret, and let those like Diego remain nameless in the logbooks of the lost. The lab smelled like bleach and burnt coffee when I arrived, 2 scents I had come to associate with hope on the verge of collapse. I carried Tomas's recorder in my coat like contraband, fingers digging into its plastic casing as though I could coax more truth from it that way. The rain had left a satin on the windows, distorting the moon into a bruise. My instruments hummed their patient tunes, waiting to be asked questions for which they might not have answers. I set the recorder on the spectral analyzer and fed its WAV file through filters until the hiss and the gulls thinned to a pale memory. The repeated clicks resolved into a lattice of harmonics I didn't recognize, harmonics nested like Russian dolls, and echoing at depths deeper than the equipment's calibration sheet dared. Then the whisper folded through, soft, layered, like a chorus sung underwater. When the image rose in my head, it wasn't lines of number, but color, the kind of synesthetic translation that made me ashamed for not being purely objective. There was blue like lamplight, then the sense of a spiral, like a shell drawn into itself. A knock at the door startled me. For a panicked half-second I expected the Navy, a black shape, polite voices with 2 smooth accents. It wasn't them, it was Jonah, my grad student, palms raw from repairing a trawl motor. He wore a grin full of the kind of naivete I had been losing. "You look like hell, Lena." He came over and peered at the screen. His eyes went wide.
"What is that?" Something that sings when the world forgets, I said. It sounded dramatic. Sometimes being dramatic was the same thing as being precise. I minimized the waveform and pulled up the acoustic signature overlay from the coastal array. For months, I'd collected fragments, pings that flagged in the margins of official reports, odd dips in biodiversity surveys, a spike in dolphin strandings annotated in a conference paper nobody read. On the overlay, Tomas's pattern fit into a ragged constellation of anomalies clustered along the shelf, a line of dark points like bruises. Jonah's face hardened in the way of someone young enough to believe there could still be heroes. Could be military sonar, he suggested. Could be seismic. Could be, or not, I interrupted. Or something that uses sound like a hand. Saying it out loud made my heart beat in a rhythm I recognized, a little like fear, a lot like the hope that grew from doing the work itself. Jonah, I need you to pull every log we have for the last 3 months, all acoustic files, cross-reference with reported disappearances, vessel movements, anything out of the ordinary. No one else, not yet. He hesitated, eyes flicking to the door as if the Navy itself might be listening through the seams of the building. Is this, he began. Confidential, I said. We don't file a report yet. We gather, we confirm. We do not let the men in black make the decisions for us. We worked in a tight orbit, Jonah with coffee-stained fingers and a hunger for discovery, me with the careful compulsions of a scientist who still believed truth could be teased into shape. We pulled records, cross-checked times, overlaid maps. The pattern held, a lattice of strange acoustic signatures, clustered nights when the tide ran thin and fishermen reported boats humming with an unfamiliar current. On the river of data, Diego's date floated like a ragged leaf. At 02:13, his small boat pinged something unnatural. The signal pulsed, repeated, then stopped. A vessel, not ours, activated an array for 7 minutes and then vanished. I kept thinking that if I published anything, if I called in journalists, if I uploaded files to repositories, if I rang the nearest network anchor, someone would be declared reckless, and yet keeping silent felt like complicity and cowardice. Every file I flagged was a face that might be saved, a father who might be able to name his child if we found the right language to translate what those harmonics meant. 2 days later, with a stack of cross-referenced anomalies and a coffee-stained thumbprint on the front page, I met Tomas at the pier. He had a new kind of stillness. The sea had cleaned the salt from his hair, leaving granite where relief might have been. He stood with his hands in the pockets of a jacket whose zipper was a million small meetings with the wind. When he saw me, something uncoiled in his shoulders that was equal parts gratitude and dread.
You did what I asked, he said, voice low. I did more, I said. I found patterns. Not proof, but patterns. There are ships showing up at times we've got anomalous acoustic artifacts. Someone's running arrays in places they shouldn't be, and we've got multiple recordings with similar spectral signatures. He lit a cigarette, and the glow made his face a burnished moon. You think that will bring Diego back? Will that make him remember his own name? No, I said, but it might give us leverage. If we can show that the signatures are consistent and that state actors are involved, perhaps we can pressure an independent body to look. I stopped. There are moments where you say perhaps and lose a man's last thread of hope. Tomas stared at the water as if he could fish reality from it. That's not what I want, he said finally. I don't want a body that will come take my tapes. I don't want men with suits that smell like sand and steel. I want him back. We both knew the choice before it was spoken, to keep digging, to risk the Navy's attention and whatever measures they believed necessary to secure the area, or to step back and accept a smaller, safer ignorance that left names like Diego's dangling. The decision was moral, not fiscal, and it tasted like copper in the mouth. There's someone who can help, Jonah blurted, as if giving a name could make things easier. Mira Klein. She used to work on acoustic telemetry for the Coastal Defense Program before she left. People say she... Before he could finish, Tomas flinched. It was the kind of flinch that maps a man's history. His lips tightened like a drawstring. Mira's not the kind that helps fishermen, he said. She's not the Men in Black type, Jonah said, trying to soothe him. She moved away, came back for reasons no one wanted to talk about. She knows the systems. She left because she didn't like what she found. The name hit me like a stone. Agent Mira Klein, the operative scientist whose reputation balanced like a coin on a ledger. Too smart for the institutions that made policy, too compromised for the activist journals. She had a presence in the rumor mill as both a fixer and a censor, a woman who could file a classified request and make a naval vessel disappear into black water.
To call her was to pull on threads that might undo all of us. "Do we have a choice?" I asked. Tomas's hands trembled around his cigarette. "We have a boat," he said finally. "We have a memory. We have your instruments. But if Mira shows up, and she will if we start poking, things will change. She can lock me down, she can bury tapes, she can make it a national security case, and then we lose it to policy," I finished. I wanted to keep my voice steady for both of us. The truth, as always, was a sharp thing between us. We didn't call her that night. We debated instead. What to salvage first? What evidence would survive a seizure?
Tomas suggested making copies, hiding the originals in places the state wouldn't think to look. Old fish lockers, a church box, the hollow beneath his son's bunk. I suggested encryption, anonymized uploads, leaving breadcrumbs in places only Jonah could find. As the debate leaned toward action, a new problem arrived like a gull diving into a grave. That afternoon, the university sent a terse email to my inbox. "Urgent. Compliance audit. Please prepare raw acoustic files, field notebooks, and any third-party communications regarding anomalous coastal signatures for review by Security Division." The subject line was polite, the meaning was not. It smelled like someone had finally noticed my marginalia. It smelled like the men in black getting a search warrant. My palms went cold. I thought of Diego's face, the notch on Tomas's nip where his grief had bitten into him. If the university let those files go, if the security division pried my drives free and shipped them to a lockup with no oversight, then the pattern we might use to argue for an independent inquiry would dissolve before we could stitch it together. Was the audit a coincidence? Or the first maneuver of the long arm that watches the ocean and the people who pay too much attention to it? I told Tomas. He clenched his jaw until the cigarette snapped. "They're looking," he said. "They always notice when someone gets too loud." "Then we move," Jonah said. His youth was dangerous and perfect. "We take what we can now. We back up to physical drives. We hide copies in different jurisdictions. We create a paper trail that shows independent analyses." Tomas's eyes found mine, and in them a dangerous, painful trust settled. He had already trusted me enough to share Diego's recorder. Now he was offering something riskier. The assumption that I, too, would risk the small, secure world that had saved me from living like a ghost among budgets and rejections. The shore diner where we met later that night smelled like fried dough and a radio playing a song someone had cried to 1,000 times. Over coffee that was too sweet, we planned like fugitives. We would retrieve additional recordings from fishermen at dawn before the audit could be enforced. We would copy files, bury originals, and get them to an off-site storage server in a jurisdiction where the Navy's subpoenas were slower. We would be careful. We would be brave. We also knew the cost of being brave. It could mean jail time. It could mean being labeled alarmists. It could mean losing livelihoods. Tomas's voice had the brittle quality of someone who had already lost more than his share. "If this is a hunt," he said, "I don't want to start it on my own." "We won't, I promise, because promises are the currency of the desperate. But if we find what we hope not to find, if it's them, and they're more than signatures and lights, then we have to decide what to do next."
Do we go public, risk panic? Do we try to negotiate? Do we bargain for lives with people who only understand control? For a moment, the conversation dissolved into silence that was not empty but full of all the possibilities that could fold in on us. In the corner of the diner, a television muted a newscast about a minister promising calm. The words "national security" flashed on the subtitle and made the hair on my arms stand up. When we left, the rain had stopped. The moon was a coin polished by the sea. Tomas walked me to my car and didn't try to be gallant. There are things worse than bad manners after grief. He placed his hand on my forearm and held it the way an anchor might rest on a rope. The touch was a small, steadying thing, and in it there was a seed of something that wanted to become more than urgency and data. Hope is a dangerous engine in a crisis. It can be love in disguise, or love can be the patient sibling of courage. I didn't know which this was. "Be careful," he said. "You too," I replied. The words were two mirrors, both trying to keep the other from cracking. That night I encrypted my drives, wrote coded notes, and planned a pre-dawn run. Sleep was a shallow mimicry. My mind built scenarios in which we succeeded and in which we were crushed by decisions made in rooms with black carpets and smooth voices. Outside, the sea kept its private conversation with the shore. Somewhere beneath its skin, harmonics rose and fell like breath. The question that kept threading through all my thoughts, the question that would not let go of its hook, wasn't merely whether we could find evidence. It was whether we could keep our humanity in a world that might prefer to trade names for neatness. We were about to step into the first true wave. The water would either carry us forward or pull us under. And before dawn, the world would make its first move. The pier smelled of diesel and ozone when we met at dawn, a gray that felt like regret made visible. Tomas's boat bobbed like a tired animal. He moved around it with the practiced economy of someone who has memorized its joints. Jonah arrived with 2 duffel bags and the electric tremor of someone who still believed in the triumph of data. I had a backpack with encrypted drives and a list of times and coordinates that felt like a litany. We were a ragged expedition, one man whose boy had been taken, one scientist who had finally chosen to pry open a bruise, and a graduate student with the kind of loyalty that looks like bravery until it bends. The rest of the town kept to itself, lanterns lifted, nets coiled. The sea, patient as always, licked at the pilings. Morning made everything more urgent rather than clearer. The world demands light in order to hide the things it wants you to see. We pulled up 2 tapes from fishermen who'd sworn they heard music in the hull of the ocean.
We copied files onto drives stenciled with nonsense names, Archive 7, personal memoirs, each one a small act of rebellion. Tomas moved like a man holding together by thought alone. His hands trembled, but did not drop the recorder. At one point he laughed, a sound that fell into the paper-thin air like an apology. Jonah's fingers flew, eyes darting to the horizon, as if the water itself might carry agents with black raincoats on the next wave. 2 more, Jonah said quietly, sliding a 3rd memory card across the console. His face was blank in a way that made me watch him like a clock. Found them in a crate under a top board, old fisherman stuff, got dust on it like history. But the signatures, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. They fit like keys in a lock. All those odd harmonics, that chorus of layered frequencies, distinct but related, spoke to something consistent, something deliberate. The pattern wasn't random noise. It was a language we were only beginning to suspect. These need to go off-site tonight, I said, encrypted, with mirrored copies in 3 locations. We cannot give them a single path to seizure. Tomas nodded, and for a second his face seemed to smooth, like a tide pulling grief back from the edge. Diego used to hide shells under his pillow, he said. He'd called them treasures, said they were stores of other places. Maybe you're making a treasure of this, Lena. I wanted to tell him that treasures kill, wrap a hand around you until you forget how to breathe. Instead, I only said, we'll keep them safe. We worked with that fierce, hungry quiet that people bring to jobs they know might be the last honest thing they'll do. Boats hummed. Men shouted. The town breathed on in the distance, giving us a wide berth as if it could feel the sharpness of our purpose and didn't want to be cut. It was nearing noon when Tomas' phone rang, one of those old push-button things that makes a sound like metal trying to laugh. He glanced and dropped the handset slowly, as if the motion required an apology to gravity. It's Mira, Jonah said, voice thinner than I expected. The name felt like a distant wave hitting the shore, a thing you knew would come, but you had hoped it would not come like this. I'd pictured her in laboratories, the sterile queen of classified corridors. I had not pictured her in my town. Tomas's jaw worked. She called me once, he said, after Diego disappeared. Said she wanted to help. Said she could. He swallowed, and the word help grumbled in his mouth like old bread. Then she sent men to talk to me. Calm voices. They left pamphlets about grief counseling. I thought she was trying to burn me out. She left because of what she saw, Jonah said. Or she left because she couldn't live with it. Either way, she knows the systems. She knows their language. We all knew, in a way that needs no elaboration, what Mira represented. The gatekeeper of secrets, who could as easily lock truth away as liberated it.
The men in suits might be faceless instruments, but Mira was an instrument made flesh. Brilliant, exacting, and always balancing an ethical equation we weren't allowed to see. Tomas answered, the line a thin filament between him and the woman who had once been an adversary, and perhaps the only person with the authority to make or break our work. Her voice came through measured, professional, like an instrument itself. She said she'd heard there were anomalies, that someone in the university's systems had triggered a compliance audit. She said she was close by and that she could offer secure assistance. The words filtered through the tiny radio in the boat like offerings from a priest. "You want to bring her here?" Jonah asked, suspicion in every syllable. "If she truly helps, yes," I said. We needed someone with access. We also needed someone who didn't want to destroy what we were trying to save. Those aims don't always sit in the same breast. Mira appeared that afternoon like a storm with a suit. She walked the pier with the calm of someone for whom every step was rehearsed. Her hair was cropped, her coat functional, and when she smiled, it was like a hinge clicking into place, warm but meant to hold something heavy. She studied Tomas with a look that was not pity and not accusation, but rather an inventory. Her eyes flicked to the drives in my bag and lingered there, as if assessing their worth. "Lena Serrano," she said, name precise, like a label on a specimen. "Dr. Serrano. I read your name in a brief. You can't imagine how often the universe offers penance disguised as inconvenient data." She admitted, without the flourish of confession, that she'd worked with acoustic telemetry for the defense program until she'd seen something she hadn't been allowed to publish. She left, she said, because the work became less about observation and more about containment. Models that would justify action, memos that recommended erasure in the language of security. Her voice thinned when she said the word containment, and a shadow crossed her features that wasn't meant to be seen. It broke the practiced edge of her demeanor. In that second, she was a woman who had once wanted what we wanted and had paid a price for it. She offered help. She also offered conditions. She wanted access to our raw feeds, our field notebooks, our unredacted logs. She wanted the drives for analysis under her supervision. "I can help," she said, "but it can't be in fragments. If there is a program active in the water, it's not charitable. It will cover its tracks. If we are to stand a chance at understanding, we give the entire record to a trained team." Tomas's face went unreadable. The fear that had been coiled in him for months flexed and showed teeth. "And if the trained team decides this is a national security matter?" he asked. "If they take everything and give me a pamphlet on dealing with loss?" Mira didn't look at him. She looked at me.
"Lena, if you trust me, if your analysis is credible, then we present to a panel with oversight. We make it beyond the reach of a single desk. That's how it worked when I had clearance and conscience. But there are people who will make the call to lock things down. We have to be strategic." The words clearance and conscience sat uneasily in her mouth like two incompatible cargoes. Her offer was at once a lifeline and a leash. We were, in short, at the edge of a canyon whose width we could not measure. The fractures began small and then widened fast. Jonah, who had been the sinew holding us together, began to look like someone on whom the strain had worn. He wanted to hand everything to Mira. He saw in her experience the solution to his youthful anxiety. Tomas recoiled at the idea of handing anything to authority. "They'll make me play dead on camera," he said. "They'll urbanize my grief into a classification." "If we don't bring in someone with clearances," Jonah argued, "they'll subpoena the university and take everything. We can get lost in red tape. Mira can bypass that." "And how do you feel about that, Lena?" Tomas asked. He sounded like a judge, the tide of his anger making a courtroom of the pier. I felt like a jury that hadn't been given instructions. Mira had the rover of possibility, a woman who could either expose or bury the truth, depending on which way the legal wind blew. I thought of Diego again, and the absence of his face in photos, the way memory can be occluded like fog by a program that decides which scenes are worth keeping. We argued until the gulls tired and the light slid toward evening. Words became knives. Jonah's insistence that we should trust someone who had walked inside the rooms of secrecy tore at Tomas's belief that the state would ever be a sanctuary for a father's pain. Tomas's refusal to let the drives out of his hands felt like patriotism of a different kind, the allegiance of a man to his missing child over abstract institutions. Then Jonah did something subtle and seismic. He slipped away with one drive. He said he'd be back in an hour, that he was making a copy. He lied to us and to himself. He took the drive to a friend in another town, someone who owed him beer and loyalty. He gave them a copy and asked for safekeeping. He thought he was saving us from being swallowed whole. He was, in truth, stepping into a web whose strands he could not yet see. By the time he confessed, hushed, fumbling, eyes red with the shame of revelation, the fracture had already widened into an absence. Tomas felt the trade. "You gave them to someone we don't know," he spat. "You gave him pieces of my boy?"
Jonah stammered. "I thought if we split the burden, no one thing gets taken. If they seize your boat, if they come here, at least what?" Tomas's voice broke, a thin wire snapping. "At least someone else can be eaten too." Mira watched us with the patience of someone who has seen alliances unspool and reform. But in her stillness, there was an honesty that felt like wind. "I didn't come here to police moral errors," she said. "I came to offer an instrument, oversight. We will have to decide if the truth is worth a public rupture. If it is, we accept consequences." We had no consensus. The town, patient as ever, had its own way of choosing, by whispers, and a community that knew when to close streets and when to shout. A neighbor knocked on Thomas' door that evening, eyes hollow. "They took our boy at night," he said. "Men in wetsuits, no papers. My girl says her husband came back and had the smell of salt and someone else's house on him. She can't remember the night they married." The neighbor's voice was thin as driftwood, grief collected like fog. Our group splintered. Jonah, broken by guilt and his own youthful certainty, left to find the man who'd agreed to hold the copy. Tomas took his boat out by himself at night, a decision that felt like something between prayer and suicide. Mira stayed, largely because she had no other place to go. She slept in a bench near the pier and stood at dawn, a sentinel who could neither be wholly trusted nor entirely dismissed. I remained, carrying drives like ribs, protected and vulnerable. In that week, the town changed. People who had been neighborly now avoided one another's glances, as if proximity could spread whatever it was we had found. Posters appeared: "Keep calm, report anomalies to the Coast Guard." The language of containment became the language of the public square, and yet the disappearances continued like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to finish. Then a new truth came uncoiled. A neighbor whose wife had returned from the water wandering and with an accent that wasn't hers, foreign, layered, came forward with a video he'd been too frightened to show. It was shaky, taken from the shore, of a shimmer breaking the water like glass. For a flash that lasted less than a breath, a shape rose, a curvature of light like a back, then a face that was not a face, and then, as if remembering it hadn't been meant to be seen, the sea pulled it under, and the clip ended. We watched it in the lab, the room a small island. The footage, small and grainy, said what the waves had tried to whisper. Whatever lived under the water had a shape and the ability to choose when to be known. The video made questions into facts. Facts demanded action. Action invited consequences. At that moment, as if the world had been wound to the point where its spring would either break or release, the men in suits came. They moved carefully, with the practiced gentleness of predators who also wore diplomas. They were not rude, they were effective. They asked for the drives, they asked for an audit, they asked for cooperation and smiled like people who had rehearsed sympathy. Tomas refused. He made a stand with words, with a stubborn honesty that had been his only currency. "This is my son," he said, to the nearest man in a suit.
"These are his sounds. You will not silence a father's name." The man's face was unreadable. For a second, it felt like history held its breath. Then the man in the suit made a phone call, and the tone of his voice slid into a register that turned pity into policy. "Agent Klein," he said, "we're initiating a protective seizure." Mira stepped forward like a shield. "Not without oversight," she said. "If you're going to seize material, it will be under a commission with civilian scientists present." They laughed then, low and calibrated. "That's not how we do this," the suit said. "This is a national security matter." Jonah, who had given away the copy in a fit of naive prudence, wept once and then controlled himself. The drives began to move, their trajectory decided by hands whose right to decide we had never ceded. Tomas tried once more to keep them, to anchor himself in the only thing that made sense: memory. He reached for them, and a hand, gloved and firm, closed around his wrist. He pulled away as if burned. For a breathless second, the three of us, scientist, fisherman, and idealist, found ourselves on opposite sides of a river carved by the very secret we'd unearthed. When the truck drove off with the drives, the town seemed to tilt. It wasn't merely the loss of evidence, it was the theft of agency. Tomas's face folded. The lines that the sea had pressed into him deepened.
He looked at me with something that was a question and a verdict. Around us, people lowered their heads like people who had been told to recite the untruths of safety. We had crossed into a place where truth had a price. We had lost something with the outward transfer of plastic cases and encrypted zeros. We had lost the narrative control of our own lives. The fracture that had run like a hairline crack the week before now yawned open. Friendships split on the edge of moral choices. Jonah became an exile in his own conscience. Tomas became a smaller man, crouched and furious. Mira stayed, and in her staying there was a new ambiguity. Had she truly wanted to shield us, or had she come to calculate what kept the water quiet without breaking contracts with the men who build walls around truths? At the end of the day, I sat alone on the pier, watching the boat's silhouette move with the tide. The world felt rearranged, as if someone had shifted the furniture of reality and left an empty chair where Diego had once been. I tried to stitch meaning back into place with the tools I had: logic, observation, the stubborn belief that numbers could be testimonies. But some things aren't reducible to numbers. Some things are names. Some things are the ache of a father who has been told he is too loud. By nightfall, we were 3 people on different stomached tides. None of us slept. The ocean hummed beneath the pier like a distant choir. Whatever came next would ask of us more than courage.
It would ask of us trust and reckoning, and the willingness to name the sea's crimes with a voice that could be heard past the sound of men who owned silence. The fractures would not heal by themselves. They required confession, action, or surrender. We had not yet chosen which. The rain came back like an accusation the night Tomas left his boat tied to no one's anchor and walked into the town like a man who had turned his grief into a plan. Jonah had disappeared into the city with a borrowed car and a pocket full of regrets. Mira stayed at my side with a watchful quiet that had softened into something like contrition. For hours we watched the horizon as if it might cough up its secrets. Instead, it gave us the slow, certain shimmer of patrol lights, and then nothing. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. Tomas. He had a voice that sounded younger, as if rage had stripped away years. "They're taking another," he said. "Right now, off the eastern shoal." A boat went dark. He didn't ask for help. He told me where to meet him. We moved like thieves and saints. Mira drove with the kind of precision that comes from someone who has practiced making impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Jonah arrived, eyes rimmed red, hands trembling, as if contrition could be a map. Tomas met us at the dock, water stealing at his boots, and for a moment the 3 of us, scientist, fisherman, operative, stood in the drowned light and recognized that the fracture could be mended only by a joint grip on danger. "There's a dive buoy," Tomas said. "Old markers. The Navy tags them sometimes, but there's an old channel that current forgets. I think they're trying something there." He showed us coordinates scrawled on grease-stained paper, the handwriting a map of hope and fury. Mira's face went still. "If they're active, they'll have containment teams. If they're experimenting with cognitive acoustics, we don't know what they'll do to interfere." She fastened a harness with the economy of someone who straps herself into missions rather than rhetoric. "But I know a way to get you under without the Navy noticing," she said. "We've got one blind spot where the civilian AIS is messy and the lineup of fishing boats makes the traffic look normal." We dressed in borrowed neoprene that smelled faintly of petrol and old gilt. Tomas handed me a small packet, a silver band that had once belonged to Diego, found in a locker during one of his makeshift searches. "If I don't come back," he said, voice raw, "take it. Tell him I looked for him." The words were a compass that pointed at something tender and terrible. The offer cracked me open. We dove under a moon that looked like an offended coin. The water closed around us with an intimacy that felt like judgment. Through the dark I saw lights bloom, bioluminescent trails that could have been stars lost in tide. The harmonics we had catalogued rose in the deep like a choir learning its lines.
Jonah's rebreather hissed. Mira signaled. Tomas's silhouette was steady, a presence carved by loss. Then we saw it, a shape coiling, pathetic and strange, like a living cathedral. It was neither beast nor machine. It moved with a grace that taught us shame. When it came close, something in the world unlocked, a cascade of images and a sound that pitched itself into memory. I felt the same thumbprint on my mind I had felt from the recorder. Star constellations underwater, faces folding into and out of recognition, and a sorrow that was enormous and not malicious, more like bewildered hunger. The operator on our stern radio, distant, officious, crackled. Unidentified subsurface activity logged. All craft stand down. The Navy's voice was a blade. Lights stabbed the water. We were visible now, trespassers in a secret that preferred the dark. Tomas surged forward, reckless as love. He reached into the water and pushed his palm toward the nearest luminous body. The creature paused, then unfurled a filament that touched his hand with a tremor that spelled out a name. For a suspended second, I heard Diego's laugh, childlike and entire, and then the sea answered with a pulse that smelled like memory. A spotlight caught Tomas mid-reach. Men in black harnesses dropped from the sky like punctuation. We were surrounded. Mira surfaced inches from me, eyes furious and afraid. She radioed, then took a step between the men and Tomas, a simple, decisive motion that unmade the protocol that had come with suits and badges. "You want to seize him?" she said, voice cold and resonant. "Then take me instead." The words landed like a charge. She had already made the calculation that would ruin her career but save a man. Her hand covered mine briefly, an electric hello and a vow. The lead agent hesitated. In that pocket of indecision, the creature blew a breath that rippled outward. Tomas convulsed as if someone had reached into his chest and rearranged the furniture. For an instant, terror and relief unspooled together. Then he opened his mouth and called a name, Diego, clear as a bell. His cry landed on the deck like a thrown lantern. Soldiers flinched as if at an unaccustomed kindness. A few meters away, a diver surfaced with a limp form, alive, small, shivering, and utterly bewildered. Diego. They had him. They had not taken him for consumption. The price they demanded was everything else. Mira stepped in front of Tomas, between the agents and the boy. "Make me the scapegoat," she said to the lead man. "But this boy stays with his father." Her career, I understood in a flash, would be the sacrifice. Her face went pale with the knowledge and acceptance of what she offered. The lead agent looked like a man given a calculus he had not practiced. One life for another's file. He signed a command and, with the bureaucratic grace of men who have practiced good enough evil, consented.
They would let Diego go, but under conditions. Mira would step out of command, take responsibility for breach of protocol, and accept custody in place of the drives. Her hand, which had touched mine, was now the cost. Tomas collapsed against his son like a ship running into harbor. He sobbed, a raw, night-sounding thing. I watched Mira, who had turned her back to the suits and the world that had taught her containment, fold like a book, and hand over her badge with the dignity of someone who had finally chosen whom she served. We left the water with the boy between father and community, the town waking to the small miracle of a child's return. Mira walked away with the weight of consequences already settled on her shoulders. Tomas's eyes found mine, wet, relieved, and full of a gratitude that was also love. He took my hand, rough and honest, and in the palm of it I learned a new language of devotion that had begun as shared danger and became something like promised company. We had bargained with the dark and paid in human currency. The sea kept its mystery, but for once its hunger had been answered by a father's hand and a woman's moral sacrifice. In that trade, the fracture began to stitch, not perfectly, but enough. The world would require payment later, lawsuits, inquiries, career obituaries for Mira. But in the salt and the night, with Diego breathing in the crook of his father's arm, we found a truth too human to cede, that love, given when the world asks for courage, can make the impossible return. Mira left with a badge in her palm and a quiet that wasn't empty but deliberate, resignation by way of offering. She would carry hearings and headlines. She would lose rank and gain a small, stubborn peace. In the weeks that followed, she testified, confessed, and watched the system rattle like a net with a new hole in it. Jonah stayed, fixing boats and data, and slowly earned back the town's wary trust by teaching fishermen how to archive and hide what mattered. Tomas found Diego in the orbit of simple, daily rituals, a shared coffee, a crooked smile, a shell under a pillow. Lena kept studying, no longer to be cited, but to witness. Between her and Tomas, an intimacy grew that required no grand gestures, only presence. A hand on a hip while counting nets, a quiet sharing of salt-stained histories at dawn. The world outside argued about policy and panic. The shore remembered. At low tide, children found strange, bright things in the sand and named them treasures. And the sea, mysterious, enormous, culpable and generous, kept its secrets, quietly answering only those who knelt to listen.